Kingdoms of Amalur is easily one of my favorite RPGs and one that never got the attention that it properly deserved. The game was made up of some of the best talent in the industry, along with outside talent that adapted their skills to this game. Amalur is a game that provides compelling combat, exploration, and a good story with an interesting world, while really offering the player with options to truly roleplay within that space. Reckoning provides the player with loads of options in how the game lets you interact with the world. You can opt to persuade individuals, lockpick doors, make your own weapons and armor, and so much more. Amalur is a game that truly lets the player enjoy the open world how they want to. It is easily one of the best RPGs I have ever played. Join me as we take a look back at Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning. In 2006, Major League Baseball pitcher Curt Schilling was interested in starting a game company. He wanted to create a new, massively multiplayer online role-playing game, a genre that he was a fan of. He talked to his family and friends to get this idea off the ground. This resulted in him recruiting some very big talent like fantasy writer R.A. Salvatore and artist Todd McFarlane. This studio would be known as 38 Studios. They began acquiring talent across the industry for their game. They recruited the lead designer from EverQuest, along with acquiring the developer Big Huge Games from publisher THQ. Big Huge Games was responsible for the successful strategy game Rise of Nations. This happened at a good time since THQ was looking to close the studio for cost reduction. At the same time, Big Huge Games was very interested in making an RPG, and they were actually in the middle of working on one of their own called Crucible. Now joined up with 38 Studios, the goal was to create two games at the same time. There would be some crossover between 38 Studios and Big Huge Games, but both would be responsible for their own projects. 38 Studios would mainly focus on this new MMORPG, and Big Huge Games would be creating a single-player focused RPG. R.A. Salvatore would be the writer on both, along with Todd McFarlane leading the art direction on both projects. The single-player RPG was codenamed Project Mercury, and the developers were interested in gathering more industry talent for their game. This resulted in acquiring the lead designer of both Morrowind and Oblivion to be the project lead for Mercury, along with many Bethesda alumni, the senior designer from The Force Unleashed, and veterans of Civilization 1 and 2. With the team formed, Project Mercury changed to Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning and would be a massive single-player RPG set within an original open world. R.A. Salvatore said that writing for video games is a very different process. His focus for his books were to create characters that the reader could live vicariously through. But in a game of this type, the player is essentially writing their own characters, and this results in a different mindset for the game's writing. He wanted to create a world with beauty, comfort, and a feeling of home to the audience, while also offering darker and more dangerous aspects to it. To ensure that Amalur had a rich foundation for its story, the developers worked with Salvatore to create a 10,000-year history of the world. This would include information on the different races that populated Amalur, the feuds between different groups and organizations, and big world events that would affect the landscape. Incorporated into this, the writing team looked to existing mythology and folklore for inspiration, along with seeing why some cultures had succeeded and others had failed. The writers wanted the world interconnected and layered. Along with this, the foundation would not only be the basis for this game, but future games set within this world. When Todd McFarlane was brought onto the project, he did not want to be used in just a conceptual art capacity. He wanted to have control over everything visual within the game. He had been disappointed on what he had seen from prior games, including animation, and he wanted to try and present something better in this area. This also allowed for a collaborative effort between McFarlane and the animation team. McFarlane would come up with the ideas, and the team would then adapt those ideas with their own perspectives. Then both of them would work to tweak and fine-tune the creatures of the world. From a visual standpoint, they wanted the world to be inviting for the player, that they were pulled in by the visuals and wanted to explore this realm. Story was going to be a large focus for the project, even down to the different towns and buildings that the player would see. The developers wanted this to be a place that the player would want to save. This wasn't just about building large spaces for the player to explore, but rather where the environments and the structures would tell their own story about the people who live there. This would be the team's way to convey storytelling visually to the player. The developers wanted this game to be very colorful and saw this as a way to really stand out, since during the PS3 generation, many games did not go for this high level of saturation. The team wanted the art, along with all the other elements of the game, to really highlight how unique this world was. This was going to be a new IP and a rare opportunity for developers to really be able to create a fantasy world from the ground up. Since the lead writer constructed the lore for the world, the artists were able to use those elements from the rich history and implement them into the visuals for the game. For example, a sword wouldn't just be a sword within Amalur. How it looked and what markings were on it would be related to something and integrated into the world itself. This allowed the rich story to flow through every area of the game. Ken Rolston had a compelling goal for the game. He wanted the players to have a strong desire to see the game's story to its conclusion, along with being distracted by the various amount of other quests that the player could accomplish. He wanted the player fully invested in the story, compelled to see the conclusion, and yet engaged by the additional quests so that the player would not want to stop playing. He wanted Amalur to offer incredible depth and non-linearity with a game that encourages you to see everything that you want. The game would be full of discovery within its exploration, and this would be part of its combat as well. For example, the player could discover new synergies based on what two weapons they had equipped and what spells they chose to do. One of Ken's main goals was to create a top-notch combat system for this role-playing game, something that no one had seen yet in this space. Even in the earliest stages of this idea, the team did not know how they would create something like this and pull this off. This resulted in starting to develop a combat system that would be more familiar in an action game rather than in an RPG. This would allow the team to make the combat more reflex-based with its mechanics and prevent this area of the game from being bland. Essentially, the team wanted to have the flair and drama from an action game, but not the extensive amount of memorizing lists of combos to use it. The combat was going to be more action-focused with a simpler execution. For example, the player can equip two different weapons at the same time. Each weapon is dedicated to a different button, so the player can easily swap between them while in battle. Even with this simple system, it would allow for plenty of options. For example, the player would perform different sword attacks depending on if they hit the button several times, held it down, or hit the attack button with some delay. This is where Todd McFarlane helped with the animations to enhance the combat and present smoother movement. Ken made it clear that he did not want to make an action game. He stated in interviews that he wanted to steal aspects from action games as inspiration for the action in this role-playing game. It was important for him to make the distinction that while the combat would contain flashy action, this wasn't going to be an action game. As part of the combat system, the developers wanted to encourage the players to experiment and change up their playstyle throughout their journey. Players could take a more direct approach and be a pure fighter, but the game also offers the players with options to be a fighter who could teleport around the arenas. Amalur would provide a wealth of exploration where the player could go and find loot, but that sense of expected exploration in an open world was something that the developers wanted to incorporate into their combat system. The different paths and options would provide the player with a variety of means to dispatch their enemies, from the weapon classes and spells along with how they could be mixed and matched. The first area of the game is dedicated to providing the player with a few different weapons and spells, to learn how these things handle within this game. This way a player would not be blindly picking a class at the start and be locked into it, and in some cases forced to restart if this was not the desired playstyle for the player. By starting the game off by allowing the player to first play with some of the combat options, the game would provide the player with some time to play around with the different combat systems and allow the player to find something that would suit their initial playstyle. This would also factor into the destiny system within this game since there was no character classes. Depending on where the player puts their points into, they will unlock different destinies that will provide the player with different buffs and abilities. So the intent with the first area is to allow the player to try out some weapons to find something that they like, and then the rest of the game allows the freedom to try out new styles and options throughout the long adventure. For example, a player may start their journey as a swordsman who uses spells but then decides to incorporate ranged bow attacks to mix it up later on. As such, the combat system and destiny system would allow for a lot of player expression and customization by making different hybrid classes of sorts that enhances the player's particular playstyle. The developers wanted to feature a wealth of loot for the players to collect and use Diablo and Titan Quest as their inspiration for this area. They wanted to combine their unique combat system with the loot addiction of established action RPGs. This also factored into why the developer wanted this to be an only third-person viewed game. Many of the developers had worked on prior Elder Scrolls titles, and those games would allow for the camera to be changed from first to third. But with Amalur, the developers felt that the third-person camera was a much better fit for this game, because of the more action-based combat, along with allowing you to see what loot you have on the player. Amalur would also allow for the player to interact with the world in non-combative ways. For example, the player could become proficient in persuasion and lockpicking, opening up new paths or even completing quests in different ways. Through playtesting, the developers were able to correct issues that popped up. For example, there is a thieves group that has its own quest line within the game, but playtesters would frequently miss this group and would not even know that it was there. The developers wanted this organization to be slightly hard to find to fit the narrative, but they found that they needed to play around with changing where this group was to ensure that more players would encounter this group in their playthrough. Smaller issues popped up, like testers originally not knowing which items could be hit for potential rewards, or what could be collected for crafting in the environment, which resulted in the developers making these things more obvious to the player. Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning easily could have been a situation of having too many cooks in the kitchen for the development. There was a lot of talent being put together to create a new fantasy world and RPG. Thankfully, the developers used their different talents and skills to enhance every area of the game. While Amalur was going to be an open world RPG, the elements that made up the game were going to be very unique, even down to the colorful art style. The Destiny system would provide players with lots of options for enhancements depending on what they decided to put their points into. The combat system took many of its inspirations from action titles to deliver something new and fresh for the RPG genre, while not sacrificing the core elements that a player would want in a role-playing game. In February 2012, Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning was released to the world. Kingdoms of Amalur is an RPG with a great action-focused combat system, a good main story with plenty of interesting side stories, and a wealth of content and options for the player. The combat system operates more like an action game, making it very involving to find your own style, whether it is focusing on ranged attacks, heavy-hitting melee, or even a mixture of the two with some magic mixed in. There's an interconnected nature to the side quest, where one side quest might branch off and turn into something else from it. From a leveling and progression standpoint, the game provides the player with an extreme amount of opportunities to express themselves in the world. You can focus on improving your bartering and buying all of your equipment, or you can become a proficient blacksmith. Amalur is simply awesome.
I captained my first ship when I was no bigger than my papa's knee, and promptly crashed it into the dock, sinking 3 vessels with 1 wreck. It was then that I knew my destiny was to be a sailor. From that day forward, I spent my life on the water. 20 ships in 20 years. It must be some kind of record.
Kingdoms of Amalur excels in many areas, and one of those areas is the great combat system. Amalur's combat is heavily inspired by action games. You can perform simple combos through hitting the attack button. As you level up your skills with each weapon, you can perform additional moves like being able to lift an enemy into the air for some juggling. The moveset provides you with just enough to give you some options in how you want to attack your enemies. To add more variability to the combat are the different types of weapons you can use. You have quick attacking weapons like daggers for fast hits. The longsword provides you with the best mix of damage and speed. The large weapons like hammers and greatswords provide you with slower hitting attacks along with big sweeping hits. Then you have the different magical items like a staff and bows for ranged options. Each of the different weapons give you options depending on who you are going up against, along with how you want to express yourself through the combat. You can use a combination of a sword and a bow to give you both close and ranged options, or you can focus on all heavy weapons or quick hitting weapons. weapons. Each of the weapons feel very different from each other. The daggers provide you with that agility to the swift hits, while the hammer makes you feel like you are swinging something 5 times your size. Now all of this stuff is interesting and engaging on its own, but this is furthered through the fact that you can have 2 weapons equipped at once and you can seamlessly switch between them. Your 2 weapons are attached to their own attack button. This allows you to mix and match them on the fly with combos and contending with different enemy types at once. I played this game for over 100 hours and I found myself mixing and matching different combos to find the most efficient means to defeat my enemies. The game provides you with some good impact to your hits. This comes from each weapon feeling different to control, along with their sound effects when swinging and hitting enemies. There's a decent amount of blood to your hits when paired with the sound effects, and this only adds to the satisfaction. The weapons and combat are great, and so are the good amount of varied enemies that you will fight. You will fight bandits, spirits, monsters, and bosses. The enemies fill different types of expected roles. You have your range fighters from foes that will attack you with bows or spells. Then you have the weaker enemies that attack you in greater numbers, and then bosses and heavy hitting enemies that take a substantial amount of hits to take down. The game continually keeps the enemies interesting through their movesets along with their visual designs. In most fights you will fight a different combination of these types of enemies, along with variations of them to keep things interesting. Some enemies are more aggressive than others, and when they hit you, they will reduce your mana. Or you will have others that when they hit you, you are now diseased, and this takes a hit to your armor rating. Thankfully, you have more options in combat than just your weapons. Your shield is really useful for blocking many attacks. If you can time a block just right, you can briefly stun an enemy, and this opens them up to a quick follow-up attack. Depending on how you build your character, you will have different moves, traps, and spells to cast on your enemies. Mana is a really useful resource and can be used to assist you. If you opt to use traps, you can bait enemies into taking damage. Spells can be used for offensive and defensive means. You can cast a lightning blast and throw ice shards at enemies. Along with this, you can cast a protective shield around you so that even when enemies get close to you, they take some damage. If you focus on being more strength-based, you can cast a skill that will not have any of your attacks get interrupted for a period of time. To further this, you can combine skills from different trees to create a hybrid character class. For example, many of the heavy-hitting magic attacks take some time to cast. During that time, if an enemy hits you, it will cancel your spell. But if you cast the might-based move that allows you to take damage and not get interrupted for your attacks, you can continually cast a bunch of spells without needing to worry about being hit. Lastly, as you attack enemies, you will build up a power meter that you can unleash and hurt many enemies at once, and obtain a nice experience bonus. This move comes with some really awesome finishers. As you can see, there are many different ways to tackle the combat situations within this game, and this also highlights 2 of Amalur's strongest areas related to gameplay, the combat itself and the options the game provides you in how you tackle the world. As you level up, you gain 1 skill point. Skills can be used to help you out in a variety of different ways. You can focus your attention on lockpicking, allowing you to easily lockpick different rooms and chests, or you can focus on your detect skill so that you can find more hidden pieces of loot in the world. Then you have the crafting skills like blacksmithing and crafting gems. As you improve these skills, you can craft better equipment and gems to slot into these pieces of equipment. When crafting new pieces of armor and weapons, you can tweak what stat boosts they will provide you with, like a sword that can do both physical and fire damage, or even provide you with regenerating health. You can craft armor that focuses on providing you with more health and armor, or providing you with damage bonuses along with higher critical hit chances. There's a solid amount of different skills to provide you with different means to tackle the game. For example, you can focus on building better equipment, or you can focus on your bartering skill to provide you with cheaper prices and more gold when you sell items. So you could effectively buy better equipment easily through this means. In addition to all of this, you can slot 3 points per level up into either might, sorcery, or finesse. This is where you can focus on where you want to slot your points and how you want to approach the combat situations. I love how this is set up, and you can see what each of the different trees trees provide you with so that you can properly plan out a build. Along with this, as you put points into these trees, they will open up different Destiny cards for you to choose from. Essentially, Destiny cards provide you with different buffs and enhancements that are similar to choosing different character classes. So if you focus on all might, you will have different Destiny cards than someone who focuses on a mixture of might and sorcery. Now, the amount of options that is provided to you through the leveling may seem like a lot, but the game presents this to you in a very easy to use manner. Just like with the combat, there isn't really a wrong way to tackle the game. Amalur is about providing you with an interesting world that fully allows you to roleplay within it and lets you do what you want. This is a situation where Amalur provides a wealth of options to keep you invested in the gameplay and systems, while also giving you a lot of replay value in how everything is set up. This is furthered through how you can respec your character at any point. If you find yourself getting bored with a current build, or you want to experiment with a new weapon combination or new skills, you can go to a Fate Weaver and pay a fee to reslot all of your points. Amalur encourages you to experiment with its different avenues to tackle the game. Amalur does a great job of providing you with a direct experience with its quests, or more player-initiated exploration. As you explore, you will come across people that will need your help, along with quest lines that offer a set of quests or a longer side story. For example, early on you will come across the House of Ballads, and this is a quest line related to the Fae. You will fill the role of a fallen warrior and work to become part of this group. This is a quest line that is about a group of people who preserve their treasured stories by essentially playing them out. These sort of faction quests play out like mini campaigns. Other side quests provide you with a lighter and more humorous stories. You will come across a guy who took a potion to improve his intelligence, but the potion is wearing off. Another neat quest has you needing to get water from a magical well to help cure someone, but the well will move around the map. The game does a pretty good job of providing context to even the simple set of quests. I stumbled across a Gladiator Arena, and the quest just involved doing a set of different fights in the arena, but the story behind it made these fights have some narrative purpose. You learn that there is corruption surrounding the arena. These quests were just a set of fights, but when combined with the story around it, they became some memorable events. What I really enjoyed about the side quests is how they feel integrated into the world rather than layered on top of it. So this one quest had me looking for someone. I found out that this individual died and collected the items that he had. I went back to the initial quest giver, and then that quest turned into something else. But then I visited a village nearby and found out that the dead guy I found was bringing an item to the village to help fight a plague. This then started another quest where I had to help out the town. I really like how the side quests help to flesh out the world and how interconnected many of them get. These quests show how the people of this world are more intertwined, and it gives a nice sense of believability to the world that you are exploring.
In my experience, islands are places you visit in order to escape torment and certain death. Ugh, Gallows End is one destination I will avoid on future voyages. Unless I crash there, of course.
Amalur provides the player with a lot of optional depth and information if they choose to do it. When completing quests, you can get straight to the point and only focus on the quest-specific stuff, or you can talk to the many different people within the world, helping to flesh out the characters, the politics of the area, background on their group, and much more. Since the performances are rather good and the conversations are interesting, this was something that I chose to do a lot of the time. But the option is there if you want to bypass all this stuff. When it comes to the curated style of the open world gameplay, the game is packed with quests, some simple and many made interesting through either the design of the quest or the stories behind them. If you want to ignore more of the curated quests, you can just opt for player-initiated exploration. After you complete the opening level, you can opt to follow the main story or go in any direction you so choose. The open world is full of many towns to visit and dungeons to explore. Some areas have harder enemies than others, and while these areas can be tough for a low-level player, they can still be completed and you will be rewarded. Depending on what skills you choose to use, there will be plenty of chests to unlock or even hidden chests to find. Along with this, there are many enjoyable lore stones that you will find, giving you some context on the world through audio logs. You may even opt to talk to most of the NPCs that you come across. While your character is a mute, you will have some choices on what is discussed, along with some fun persuasion options. The game does a good job of keeping these conversations interesting from a framing perspective, with the game continually changing camera shots during the conversation. This way, the conversation is not static and boring from a viewing perspective. What I really enjoyed about this part of the game is how you can absolutely lose yourself in the exploration, and just focusing on that area of the game. Either through quests or exploration, you will gain experience and find plenty of loot to either equip or sell. Again, when it comes to new equipment, you can either find plenty of better items, or you can take the time to really get into the weeds and make your own unique weapons and pieces of armor catering to your playstyle. When it comes to the main story, I really enjoyed it, but do not expect an extreme amount of in-depth characters. But what you can expect is a familiar fantasy story mixed with a really interesting world. The main missions provide you with plenty of fun battles and boss fights to do. The presentation is pretty good as well, with some well-done cutscenes. The story really does come alive more as you interact outside of the main quest. The main quest is a portion of the overall story, and while it does provide a clear beginning and end, completing the missions involved with the different factions, along with the voluminous amount of side missions, makes Amalur feel like a fleshed out place. Like I said before, completing what appears to be a one-off quest that then interconnects with another quest chain are the type of situations that really makes this world feel more integrated. The main quest is solid with some interesting moments, along with gathering allies to take out the big bad. It has many familiar elements and it's very enjoyable. The game has 2 DLC expansions and they are very good as well. Teeth of the Narrows has some pretty good dungeons with more involved mechanics than in the base game, and I love the spear that you get to use in this area. It is important to note that this is a completely new area to explore with a good amount of locations to visit. The Legend of Dead Kell is probably my favorite of the 2 DLCs. You will hit a point within this quest where you are given control of a keep. Here you can work on upgrading different areas of the keep, and they will provide you with a lot of rewards. As you complete the main quests and side quests in this region, you are slowly gathering resources and making your keep better. You can train against enemies for more rewards, along with raising monsters that give you improvements to different stats. As you build up the keep, you can eventually sit on a throne and complete missions for people within the area, along with sending other people out on diplomacy missions. This is a pretty involved set of mechanics that I would love to see expanded in a potential sequel. Plus, the DLC has some very nice humor as well. When it comes to DLCs, I usually expect more of the same from the main game, so I am surprised when a DLC can introduce new mechanics that add or improve areas from the main game. But overall, the 2 DLCs are a welcome addition to the game. When it comes to the flaws, I only have a few. For one, you might notice that the game might have a slight stutter or pause whenever you destroy crates within the game. Another thing is how the game is designed with the loading of areas. Each of the different buildings will require you to load into them, which can take a while depending on what platform you are playing on. I had my map not work correctly when I was in one region, and then thankfully this went away. Also, there are small things that I would like to see improved, like quality of life enhancements, to the use of salvage for the blacksmithing and upgrading with the shards. The game will not let you fast travel to the island where the first DLC takes place. You have to take a boat to get there, which is an odd decision. I can understand doing this for the first part of the quest line, but requiring it later on is just odd. Probably my biggest issue with the game is how I felt like the boss fights could have been more memorable, or have something more memorable in the mechanics with the ins and outs of them. For the most part, there are ones that really stand out from a spectacle perspective, but other than that, they're just okay. Outside of this stuff, Amalur is easily one of my favorite RPGs ever made. Lastly, the game is a visual treat along with its soundtrack. Here are a few tracks from the game. Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning is an underrated RPG and deserves so much more attention than it ever received. When it comes to the many different ways that you can play this game, it succeeds at such a high level. The game truly lets you roleplay how you want to within this world, and it is a world that you want to stay in. A big part about this is from the excellent art style. This is a game that will never really look dated years later. It is gorgeous and very colorful and part of the game's identity. The combat system is simplistic yet provides a lot of satisfaction in discovering your playstyle. There is a wealth of content and options here that I never wanted to stop playing this game. While I wanted to focus on the development and the game itself in this video, it is extremely disappointing what happened from a legal side of things that caused this developer to essentially go under. That being said, it was also a nice surprise to see that THQ acquired the rights and were able to remaster the game to give it another chance to live again. I can understand that some might see the remaster as a bit disappointing, as it felt more like a re-release than a remaster for historical fans, but I was really happy to see another company try and breathe some life into this game. Reckoning deserves more eyes on it and hopefully a proper sequel or more expansions someday later. If you're a fan of RPGs, I highly recommend this game and thank you very much for watching.